Hello and welcome back to another update as I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the direction of the Luhansk-Kharkiv border, where the Russians continue offensive operations in the direction of the Torets river, here to the west of Svatove. The Russians have advanced in the direction of Intensifies, Fifka, as well as Stilmehivka from the north, south of Novoselivsk. The Ukrainians have their presence here north of Stilmehivka, where they were previously also under control of Berestove, but now that they have lost Berestove, their presence here west of Novoselivsk has weakened and their pressure on the town has significantly reduced. With this, the Russians are now conducting offensive operations south of Novoselivsk to reach the Torets river and gain control over the area south of Berestove, west of Novoselivsk. At the same time, they have been pushing east of Stilmehivka, and now they are expanding to push towards Myasokharivka and Anderivka here to the south. With this, the Russians are conducting offensive operations to create and gain control over this wedge here west of Svatove to conduct further offensive operations across the Torets river line. But for now, the focus is to gain control over the river line here to the north, which will allow them to gain control over the area all the way down south to Robotin, where fighting will then move on to Makiivka, Nevsky, and the Ukrainian villages along the river line east of Liman, west of Kmina. These recent advances are a result of the Russian capture of both Kotlярivka, Kislivka, and Ivanivka to the north, as well as Berestove to the south, which has allowed the Russians to gain control over a wider part of the front here east of Kupiansk. This allows the Russians to gain control over the heights in the area and push the Ukrainians towards their fortified positions, preventing them from having this buffer zone that allowed them to conduct and concentrate their forces to conduct raids on Russian positions. With this, the Russian positions have improved, and as allowing the Russians to have their own buffer zone, which then allows them to expand their control and launch offensive operations here west of Svatove to push the Ukrainians back to the river line. If the Russians gain full control over the entirety of the river line, they can launch an offensive operations across the river line towards the Usk river line, where we'll see a similar case but on a larger scale, as the Usk river line is much larger than that of the Torets river line, despite the lengths being much similar. South of that, here in the direction of Vyemka, the Russians have pushed onwards towards the village, where they have managed to capture some Ukrainian fortified positions along the railway. With this, they are closer and closer towards Vyemka and Ivanodarivka. It is likely that the Russians will launch a common offensive against all three of these villages, Vyemka, Ivanodarivka, and Spirne from the south, and this will allow the Russians to pretty much launch an offensive operations across the Siversk front, from the direction of Rostelivka in the south, where there's also positional fighting after the capture of Vesele, and all the way to the north towards Bilorivka. The Russians are likely looking to gain control over Bilorivka and Hryvorivka here to the north, at the same time as they push towards Verkhono-Kamyanske, where positional fighting is happening by the fortified positions and trenches east of the village, in the direction of Spirne, Ivanodarivka, and Vyemka to the south, where they also look to gain control over the fortifications north of Ivanodarivka to push towards Siversk from the south, and west from Vesele and north from Soledar in the direction of Rostolivka to push the Ukrainians back south of Siversk as well. The Russians will look to launch a full offensive here across the entirety of the south and east of Siversk to gain control over everything east of the canal that goes through from the Severodonetsk River and down across Bakhmut, where fighting is taking place here, and the Russians have advanced west of and south of Ivanivsk. Positional fighting continues here east of Jazov Yar as the Russians attempt to cross the canal line towards the forest area to the south of Jazov Yar, where they'll look to enter the micro-district east of Jazov Yar, where the goal is to gain control over the entirety of the crossing area from the northern flank to the southern flank of Jazov Yar, gain control over the eastern parts of the micro-district, and gain control over the forest patches on the eastern parts of the canal. At the same time, Russian operations continue west of Klishchivka, south of Ivanivsk, to gain control over everything east of the canal in the southern direction of Bakhmut, which will allow the Russians to concentrate their manpower and forces here in the direction of Jazov Yar, where the majority of the artillery is actually active and the Russian air force is actively bombarding. The Battle of Jazov Yar continues, as this is one of the areas of the front where most soldiers are concentrated, and heavy battle takes place as both sides launch massive artillery strikes on the opponent's positions to destroy their positional bases and attack their positions prior to offensive operations happening. And during offensive operations, a lot of suppressive fire is happening. The Russian objective is to cross over and gain control over the eastern bank of the canal line, and the Ukrainian objective is simply to hold their positions and prevent a Russian advance, as the capture of Chasiv Yar would be devastating for the Ukrainian armed forces. West of Avdiivka, the Russian operations continue west of Semenivka and north of Netailove. West of Semenivka, the Russians are advancing along the main road between Semenivka and Novoselivka-Persha. The Russians' objective here is to push in the direction of Novoselivka-Persha, but have managed to capture this fortified position here west of Semenivka and are now pushing along the main road. The Russians already captured the intersection here east of Novoselivka-Persha to flank the Ukrainian positions. This has allowed them to capture the fortified position and are now moving along the main road to capture the rest of the road west of Semenivka. This will allow the Russians to create a large enough buffer zone to use Semenivka as a base for further offensive operations towards Novoselivka-Persha and Novopokrovsk. The Russians lack the ability to deploy a large contingent of troops across the river line, as the Ukrainians' close proximity to the area allows them for heavy artillery fire on the crossings across the river line. This means that the main forces coming here along Novobakhmutivka and Solovyove from the Ocheretina direction. This is why we're seeing the majority of the fighting taking place in the north. In the south, by Umansk, the Russian troops had a small contingent of troops that kept advancing along the front and has allowed them to capture Umansk completely. It is about a company-sized unit, so about 100 soldiers, that has managed to capture the village of Umansk. Near Netailove, it is similar to the Ocheretina direction, where larger contingents of troops are able to concentrate there through Pervomaiske, but the northern parts are moving along Tonenke, where they have moved through the main road. But again, here, this is a far distance between Tonenke and Yasnobrodivka, which means that the troops launch operations along the forest line to forest line, where they move slowly with small contingents of troops, and this is why the advances are small parts, as they move from one forest line to another with contingents of about 2 squads, which is about 25 soldiers. But with this advance here south of Yasnobrodivka, the Russians have closed in on the village from the south and the east. It is likely that the Russians will start operations north of Yasnobrodivka to capture the heights and fortified position north of the village on the high grounds, and from the east towards Yasnobrodivka, and from the south through the roads to gain control over the village itself and to cut off any retreat from the village towards the lakes and reservoir here west of Yasnobrodivka. The Russians here push the Ukrainians towards the lakes and reservoir, where they will push them towards the bridge and cut off the front line there. This is a very narrow path, which allows the Russians to defend the area with small groups of soldiers, and will allow the Russians to push through and create contingents of troops here north of the river line here west of Orelivka to create a larger contingent of troops across, attacking from multiple directions and on a wider front will allow the Russians to push at a higher rate, which will allow them to start attacking the villages such as Gushne to the west, Novoselivka-Persha in the center, and Sokil to the north. Moving on to the next section of the front line, we see here in the direction of Nesterienka that the Russians started offensive operations north of the fortified positions towards the Ukrainian fortified positions in the area. This is to regain control over the fortified positions the Ukrainians managed to capture in positional fighting during the Ukrainian summer offensive, and this is moving the front away from the Robotin direction towards this area here southwest of Oryhiv. This is to recreate this buffer zone that was between the Russian and Ukrainian positions, and to allow the Russians to start offensive operations towards Novandrivka and the village chain here west of Oryhiv. This is to turn the front from a Ukrainian initiative to a Russian initiative, where they could be developing frontline positions across a wider front to improve their positions if the Ukrainians plan to restart offensive operations in the area, or to develop the front for their own offensive operations in the future. And that is all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you for watching, and have a great day.